Hello class, this is Case Study 3 Part 3, the final part of our case study titled, Can We Feed the World with Organic Food Alone? We're going to now focus on water issues, which is to say, how does agriculture put a high demand on water even when it's in low supply? Now, with growing food, as you can imagine, we've got a growing human population, and water is a finite resource. So with food, water is truly a scarcity game. We're going to focus on farming technology and sustainability as it applies to water use in this next part of our lecture. So first, let's understand water. Though quite abundant on the Earth's surface, for example, 2/3 of the surface of the Earth is covered with water, most of that is salt water. So that ocean water is not usable by most living things. So 99% of the water on our planet is not potable. It is not usable for our consumption. Where do we get that fresh water from? Well, we get it from the atmosphere. It falls as both rain and snow. And that water that we use makes up only 0.001% of our atmosphere. It's pretty amazing that we can sustain life as we know it with such a relatively small amount of fresh water. It's estimated that 69% of worldwide water is used for irrigation, with 15 to 35% of that irrigation withdrawal being unsustainable. A lot of the water that we use for agriculture is not reused. And it certainly does enter into the water cycle, but it takes a long time for that water to get back into the groundwater and into sources where humans can utilize that water again. We use lots of water to grow livestock. For example, a cow on average consumes 30 to 45 gallons of water per day. So water is scarce, and there are many places on our planet where people can't even get access to clean water. Furthermore, so little fresh water is available to us in the freshwater cycle, and unfortunately a lot of what we have on our planet gets polluted. And we're going to really discuss pollution issues in greater detail in our next case study. So water pollution is referred to as a degradation of water quality, and there are different ways that we can quantify this. For example, how far does any source of water depart from the norm? What are the effects of this water on public health, and what are the ecological impacts on this water if it gets polluted? And one of the number one ways that we pollute our water is by some types of agricultural practices. The first way we contaminate our water is by chemical contamination. For example, pesticides often get into our groundwater because we're applying these pesticides to our conventional crops to help them grow. One group of these chemicals is referred to as persistent organic pollutants. These are carbon-based and synthetic. They're toxic to living things, and they do not easily break down in the environment. Finally, they are soluble in fat and therefore accumulate in forms that are easily transportable among organisms in a food chain. A second way we contaminate our water is with fecal coliform bacteria contamination. Now, many of the animals that we grow are grown in massive operations, and these are usually referred to as confined agricultural feeding operations. As you can imagine, putting that many animals in a contained space has a huge problem with airborne and waterborne pollution from all of their feces and other waste. So where do these chemicals go? Well, ultimately all chemicals end up in the water, and this can increase the biological oxygen demand in these sources. So whenever we leach different types of chemicals into the water, it can cause a huge growth of certain types of organic matter. The living things survive and then die. And then bacteria break down all this dead organic matter. Now, when the bacteria breaks down the dead organic matter, it starts to use up all of the oxygen in the water, and this can ultimately lead to water that has no dissolved oxygen, which then kills everything in that water. And this is largely due to the runoff that comes from these agricultural operations. Nitrogen loading is a problem as well. Fertilizers tend to have tons of nitrogen, and nitrogen is key for living things. Living things need nitrogen in order to do their physiology, but too much of a good thing is a bad thing, and this nitrogen loading can lead to some serious problems, including eutrophication. So, eutrophication is defined as the process by which a body of water develops a high concentration of nutrients. And eutrophication often causes a large growth in aquatic plants and photosynthetic bacteria and algae. This can be a big problem. It can alter food webs completely. First off, when there's a big mat of algae on the surface of the water, no light can penetrate into the water to reach those organisms living deeper in the water column. Now, when water becomes depleted in oxygen, that can lead to huge problems with our food webs because lots of organisms may die. Whenever we get too much nutrient loading and eutrophication, it can lead to what's called a hypoxic condition and ultimately a dead zone. Hypoxia means an absence of oxygen reaching living tissues. And right here in the United States and the Gulf of Mexico, we have one of the world's largest dead zones every single fall. So think about the river system, the Mississippi River and many of the other rivers that run through the central part of the United States. This part of our country is famous for agriculture, and all of those chemicals, all of those confined feeding operations have those chemicals and nutrients run off into the water, where it ultimately leads to this hypoxic condition and this dead zone. So there are methods that we can use to control runoff. Now for crops, it can be useful to control the volume and flow rate of runoff water to prevent erosion and nutrient leaching. We can also use nutrient management plans, in which you use only what you need without using excessive types of chemicals and fertilizers. You can eliminate excessive irrigation, which is going to do a good job of preventing excess runoff. And finally, practices such as integrated pest management and organic farming do a great job of controlling this runoff. Now for confined animal feeding operations, it's essential that they don't just dump it in the rivers, but that they store it and treat it appropriately. Also, animal operations can adjust their grazing intensity, keeping livestock out of sensitive areas, providing alternate sources of water and shade, and revegetating rangelands and pasture lands for a more sustainable landscape. So it's not just the water that's a problem, it's also the air. So agriculture can lead to a lot of air pollution. Particularly of problem is methane and nitrous oxide, both of which contribute significantly to global warming, and both of which are the byproducts of modern conventional agricultural practices. In the last part of this lecture, we're going to look at a brief conclusion for Case Study 3, Part 3. So, do we have enough land to feed the world with only organic food, which is to say no pesticides and no GMOs? Organic farming does require less water and results in less water contamination. So that can be a good thing. But can we actually grow enough food if we rely on organic by itself? Well, some people, including Michael Pollan and the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations, think that we can do it. They think that the conventional farming practices of the world are unsustainable and they need to change. However, other scientists don't think that it's possible, including many agricultural committees around the world. For one, they say that we would have to expand croplands dramatically, destroying many ecosystems in the process. And even if we did that, they believe that we could only feed about 4 billion people with organic alone. And of course, we're already well over 7 billion, on our way to 10 billion in the next decades to come. Now, phasing out all pesticides would also result in a 25% decline in crop yield. So that would also be a problem when we're trying to feed a growing human population. So as you can see, organic versus conventional is a complicated argument. Now, we might not be able to steer totally clear of genetically modified organisms and pesticides, but we need to still make choices for these different agricultural products that try to use these chemicals more sustainably. We do need to think economically to some extent. What's the best way to both feed humans and not destroy the land? It's essential that we are more sensitive to both social and environmental issues, because conventional agriculture doesn't just hurt the land, but it also hurts workers' rights, those people who are subjected to these toxic chemicals every single day. The way we're doing things now is not that great. There's tons of health and social issues, including undernutrition, malnutrition, overnutrition, and foodborne illness, all of which are found in the United States. Not to mention issues with workers' rights and immigration issues. All of these are factors that need to be considered when we're talking about agriculture. We can push to make agriculture more environmentally sustainable by using techniques such as crop rotation, no-till agriculture, and contour plowing. These are ways that we can reduce erosion and leaching and keep the land as fertile as possible for a long period of time. Also, integrated pest management can reduce the need for pesticides on our planet. You've probably heard the phrase think globally, act locally, and that is really important in this perspective. We need to protect our personal health and the environment, and we can do so by buying organic where available. In some cases, organic produce is more affordable. For example, at places like Farmers Market. In the San Francisco Bay Area, we have tons of farmers markets and community gardens where it can be possible to pursue healthy organic foods. Ultimately, we just need to try to make the most informed choices that we can, both for ourselves and our families. In our next case study, we will examine the effects of our choices on many aspects of the environment. All right, well, that's it for our case study on organic food. I hope that you learned a lot. I hope that you can think about this as you're making your purchases at the grocery store, because in a lot of ways what we buy at the grocery store is like voting for the practices that we want to see put into place for our food production. Well, email me with any questions, and thank you very much for listening.